Honestly, my main takeaway from this episode is just that me and Gyokyo are the same person, and I love that for both of us. Welcome back to Can We Talk About the Apothecary Diaries in Excruciating Detail, the series where we overanalyze every single word, meaningful glance, and imperial decree that this story throws our way. My name is Yumna. My current hyperfixation is the Apothecary Diaries, and today we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 7, where Jinshi is swamped and Maomao is hatching an escape plan without considering the romance of it all. This episode starts with an adorable flashback of Maomao and her adoptive father before she wakes up in a very nice room in the Jade Pavilion that the ladies in waiting insisted that she sleep in overnight, given everything that happened the day before with the garden party and the poisoning. And Maomao ponders, one, how her father is doing, and two, how she really doesn't feel at ease without her freckles. We then cut to Maomao with her freckles on, having a conversation with Gyokyo, where the concubine notes that Maomao has put them back on, and she is totally fine with it. She is like, after everything that happened at the garden party, everyone was asking about this lady in waiting that I had, and I think it's a lot better if you look a little less recognizable. And in this exchange, Maomao tells Gyokyo that she has caused her distress, and the light novel goes into a little more context for why Maomao says this to the concubine, because in her internal dialogue, she is reflecting upon how things kind of went after she tasted the soup and how she can understand that it didn't look great for a lady in waiting to just announce that something was poisoned and then run out of the party of her own volition without asking for permission. So essentially, when Maomao says that I've caused you distress, she is apologizing and acknowledging the fact that she may have made Gyokyo look bad, though Gyokyo does not seem to care at all. Gyokyo then tells Maomao that Gaoshun has been waiting around all morning to speak to her, and so she sent him out into the garden to pull weeds to pass the time. And Maomao notes that if Gaoshun does stuff like that, he's bound to win the hearts of a couple of ladies in waiting in the rear palace. And she also notes that Hongyang is looking a little happy. Now, a fun little tidbit in the light novel in this scene that gets left out of the anime is that when Hongyang is going to the garden to go and get Gaoshun and bring him to the parlor so him and Maomao can talk, Maomao actually tries to follow Hongyang initially so that they can both go out and grab Gaoshun, but Gyokyo stops her and redirects her to the parlor to just wait there. And I just think that this is so funny in what it tells us about Gyokyo as a character, that beyond the Jinshi and Maomao of it all, she just loves to stir the pot a little bit. We then cut to Maomao and Gaoshun having a little CSI moment where Maomao is explaining how fingerprints work, and the pair note that there are 4 sets of fingerprints on this soup bowl and that one of them is near the rim of the bowl, which is likely from the person who poisoned this soup. But along with that set of prints, there is also another set of prints at the base of the bowl, and when Gaoshun sees Maomao's reaction, he is like, why are you so shocked that there is the set of prints on the bowl? And this is where Maomao has to talk to him about what she wished she hadn't seen at the garden party, which is that Lady Lishu is being bullied by her pavilion staff. Maomao then gives Gaoshun a rundown of all of her observations at the garden party that reinforce her theory that Lishu is being mistreated by her staff, namely the outfits that Lishu and her ladies in waiting were wearing. Maomao notes that Lishu was dressed in a very garish pink, in Gaoshun's words, dress that very clearly clashed with the crimson dress that Lady Gyokyo was wearing, and that if Lishu's ladies in waiting had her best interests in mind, they would have advised against her wearing this dress, or at the very least, if Lishu was super set on it, they would have worn outfits that actually matched their mistress's outfit, but they were all dressed in white, something that Adwo's staff called them out on. The crux of all of this being that Lishu was made to look a fool in front of the emperor, all of his officials, all of the high-ranking concubines, and their pavilion staff, and Maomao wagers that it was actually the ladies in waiting who suggested to Lishu that she wear this garish pink dress, and then decided to switch her food because they don't actually believe that the modifications that Lishu asks for are for her safety, and just think that she is being needlessly picky. And while Lishu's poison taster potentially inadvertently saved Lishu's life in her pursuit of bullying and harassing her, Maomao still notes that it is quite distasteful. And I would actually take it a step further and say that it was just flat out dangerous, beyond the fact that they obviously fed her food that could kill her. Like, that part is obviously dangerous, but I think that to make Lishu look like this, to make her look like somebody who doesn't have a handle on her staff and is, frankly, to put it gently, inept at her job as a concubine in front of the emperor, in front of his officials, in front of these high-ranking concubines and their pavilion staff, something that is obviously going to get around to people that did not come come to the garden party in all the debriefs that likely happened afterwards, that isn't great. It isn't great for people to know that you as a concubine in this high-ranking position are vulnerable, that you are somebody that can be taken advantage of if needed, if that would be politically advantageous to somebody, especially in a place like the Rear Palace where there is treachery around every corner. It is something to be expected, and where Maomao notes that a concubine really can't trust anybody outside of her ladies in waiting. And the perception of Li Shu in the general public is made more explicit in the light novel, because when Maomao and Gaoxuan are having this exchange and Maomao asks him, do you recall what color Li Shu's dress was at the garden party? In the anime, he answers that it's a garish pink, but in the light novel, he is silent. And in Mama's internal dialogue, she interprets Gaoxuan's silence as him conveying that in the circles that he is in, where he hears stuff, hears the whispers, people don't have a great perception of Li Shu as a concubine. Maomao then theorizes that the motivation behind this harassment and bullying is that the ladies in waiting at the Diamond Pavilion perceive Li Shu as being somebody who is indecent due to her marriage to the previous emperor and then subsequent marriage to his son, because this is a world and a culture in which girls are taught that the most important thing is to have loyalty to her husband, and obviously Li Shu marrying her deceased husband's son is not something that is going to be seen as particularly loyal. But I think that this explanation is interesting in the way that it showcases the kind of rigidity in thinking of people in the upper classes in the Apothecary Diaries, because when we hear that, we're like, well, common sense suggests that Li Shu didn't have much of a say in the matter. Her devotion or lack thereof isn't really something that she has any kind of autonomy over, because she is at the mercy of her father and the decisions that he makes. And if anything, I think it's very clear to everybody watching that Li Shu's situation calls for sympathy, empathy, even pity, because she is a young girl who is incredibly ill-equipped to handle the role of being a high-ranking concubine. And part of me wonders if there are other factors to take into consideration when it comes to the Diamond Pavilion staff's mistreatment of Li Shu. Part of me thinks that it has to do with the lack of opportunity of working at the Diamond Pavilion, because Li Shu doesn't really have any kind of pull with the emperor. But then I think that that is giving these women too much credit, because we have seen the rigidity of thinking in upper class women in the Apothecary Diaries when we saw what happened with Li Hua, where Maomao wasn't even allowed to get near her because the ladies in waiting at her pavilion felt like Maomao was not worthy of being near her due to her social status, despite the fact that their mistress was literally dying and that Maomao was there on an imperial decree. And another part of me wonders if it has nothing to do with perceptions of indecency, disloyalty, and lack of opportunity, and if it really just came down to the fact that this was a group of upper class noblewomen who, while they have more privilege than the average woman because of their social status, are still at the whims of their male family members, coming into the service of a young girl who was vulnerable, who they realized very quickly that they could easily mistreat and take advantage of, and that was a way for them to gain this sense of autonomy and control over their own lives, and that bullying Li Shu just made them feel better about themselves. And maybe there was also a part of them that felt jealous of Li Shu, because she is somebody who had been given this very coveted position for not only one but two monarchs, and she hasn't had to necessarily do anything to be in this position, in the sense that she doesn't perform knightly duties. I think that Li Shu's situation, coupled with what Li Hua experiences earlier in the story, really drives home the fact that in order for a concubine to thrive in this role, she needs to have good, competent, and loyal staff around her. And I would argue that that is far more important than whether she has the emperor's favor or not, because that is something that may ebb and flow with time and also changing political alliances. But something that is consistent in a concubine's life is the women that surround her and are in her service. After hearing this explanation and theory, Gaoxuan has one more question for Maomao, which is why she tried to protect Li Shu's food taster during her conversation with Jinshi. To which we all know Maomao responds, because she's a food taster and her life is worth nothing compared to a concubine. And I really enjoy this exchange between Maomao and Gaoxuan for a couple of reasons. The first being that Maomao, despite her best efforts, cannot help but care, and she cannot help but be able to see this situation from a couple of different perspectives, where she can acknowledge the fact that what happened was awful and that what this food taster did was awful, but she also sees the nuances in this situation given that woman's social position, especially in the kind of hierarchy of the pavilion where food tasters are on the bottom rung of that ladder. And getting this insight about where food tasters actually sit in the hierarchy of ladies in waiting at a pavilion, it does make me think about what the motivations were behind this switching of food and whether this taster was just trying to get more into the kind of the in group at the Diamond Pavilion and gain acceptance from the other ladies in waiting by taking this pretty drastic measure. And I feel like this also ties into the question of whether all of this just had to do with feeling a sense of inferiority and wanting to quell that sense of inferiority by bullying this person who you don't feel like is worthy of holding a certain position and is also just somebody who is very easy to mistreat because Lishu is. Because when Maomao does her little spiel to scare the food taster in the last episode, she is obviously scared, but given how she completely turns it around afterwards and for the rest of the story is Lishu's closest, most trusted, genuine companion, only genuine companion in the Diamond Pavilion, I wonder if beyond the fear, that was also this taster's first moment of really seeing Lishu as a person and not just this source of a lot of frustration and inferiority. I also find Gaoxuan's approach in this conversation to be great. It almost feels like the entire episode itself is letting us know that we are going to fall harder for Gaoxuan than we already have, given what Maomao says earlier about how, you know, if he keeps this up, he's going to have a bunch of ladies in waiting falling for him, when in reality we are the ones falling for him. Because from what we've seen of Gaoxuan so far, what we understand about his role is that a lot of it is keeping Jinshi on course. And part of that is Gaoxuan having to be rigid about certain social proprieties and rules when he is interacting with Jinshi, and we'll see this a lot throughout the story. But in this specific moment, he is just genuinely curious about what Maomao is saying and what her rationale was in this situation, and he is also really receptive to her perspective, even though it would be well within his rights to just push for a punishment for this lady in waiting, because what she did was wrong and would warrant a pretty intense consequence. But instead, he tells Maomao that he's going to try to factor that nuance into his relaying of this information to Jinshi. Now, speaking of Gaoxuan being rigid about social proprieties, we cut to him catching Jinshi up on everything that he's learned, whilst also being rigid about social proprieties. Because Jinshi is exhausted. He has not been having a fun time since everything happened at this garden party, but Gaoxuan refuses to let him showcase his true nature that pulls back the veneer of who Jinshi the eunuch is. So he is like, no, you cannot nap at your desk, and no, you cannot look overtly tired and complain about being tired. Despite the fact that there is no audience present, it is just Jinshi and Gaoxuan. And here we really see that Jinshi is kind of burdened with the weight of it all. He is exhausted. He hasn't slept or changed since the garden party happened because he has just been too busy dealing with the fallout of this incident and making documentation, which he is going to continue to do after he finishes this conversation with Gaoxuan. This scene is also an instance where we really see how much Jinshi likes hanging out with Maomao and just going to go see her on these little side quests, because he does not have time for these side quests. Obviously, he has a ton of work to do because of this specific incident, but Jinshi has a ton of work to do in general. He does not have an easy job. But despite that, he still goes out of his way to go and see Maomao and to create these situations where he can see Maomao, to the point where in earlier episodes in this season, she is pondering why he has so much free time when in reality, he does not. Something that we get even more insight on in some subsequent episodes. Now, going from the doom and gloom of the garden party incident and the poisoning of it all, we cut to Maomao and Xiaolan having a conversation about one of the lighter elements of that day, which is the hairpins. And we see Xiaolan explain the general gist of the hairpins to Maomao and how she can use them to get out of the rear palace for a temporary period of time, where men can use the hairpins to, summon women out of the rear palace to go away for a time, and women vice versa can also use a hairpin given to them by a man to summon that man to have a conversation to ask him to take her out of the rear palace. Now, what both parties in this conversation fail to take into consideration is the romance of it all. We then see Maomao decide that out of the two men that she got hairpins from, Lee Haku and Jinshi, that she is going to bargain with Lee Haku to get a homecoming in exchange for giving him an introduction to one of the three princesses at the Verdigris house. Obviously, it's incredibly hilarious to watch Lee Haku's look of shock when he realizes what's at stake here in this bargain, but I think it's also just a fun callback to the fact that Maomao has been well connected. Like, she has had a network from the beginning. She is not new to this. She is true to this, and that is why she doesn't really have a hard time navigating this environment where she is just around a bunch of beautiful, accomplished women that have a high social standing. And then we get to see the Jade Pavilion's reactions to Maomao telling them that she is taking a short little trip home. The ladies in waiting are ecstatic and are very much considering the romance of it all. Meanwhile, Hong Yang very clearly sees that Maomao has not considered the romance of it all. And Gyokyo is just excited to see Jinshi find out about this, and she is so real for that. And then we do see Jinshi's reaction to finding out that he has missed Maomao by one day while he has been scrambling to get work done in order to make time to come and see her. And Gyokyo is having a great time, and so am I. She really is my self-insert character for season 1 because what a fun diva. And then we cut to Maomao and Lee Haku entering the Pleasure District. And while the scene has a generally pretty light tone to it, you're just seeing all of the colors and the chaos of this district, and Lee Haku is very excited about it all. There is something incredibly devastating when you hear Maomao narrating how close the Pleasure District is to the Rear Palace. It is literally within walking distance. So for almost a year, Maomao has been within walking distance of her father, of her other loved ones, and she just has not been able to see them. And that is incredibly sad. But we arrive at Verdegree's house, Lee Haku goes off to hang out with Pyrene, and we get some more insight into Maomao and Granny's dynamic, which I think is a lot of fun and also very interesting, where Granny very clearly cares about Maomao and her father and tells her to go and see him, and also chastises her for being gone for 10 months, despite the fact that she obviously had no say in the matter. And she also adds the expense of this meet and greet between Lee Haku and Pyrene to Maomao's tab, but at the same time, Granny is not like relentlessly chasing after Maomao to pay off this tab. It's just this very interesting, multifaceted dynamic. And then we finally get to see Maomao and her father reunite after a very long time, and they are positioned exactly the same way they were the last time they saw each other. And Loman doesn't say anything to her aside from welcome home and that she has been gone quite a long time. It's incredibly sweet, but there is also something very melancholic about the moment. Maomao then details the very lengthy story about how she ended up where she ended up in the Rear Palace, and after she finishes recounting everything and she goes to bed, Loman is up for a little bit longer, and he says to himself that it is this very interesting twist of fate that his daughter has ended up in the Rear Palace. We love a good mystery. We love a good setup for future events in the story. And that is all for this episode. Who would you have summoned with a hairpin to get a 3-day homecoming, Jinshi or Lee Haku? Let me know in the comments. And as always, can we talk about that?